Welcome everyone, my name is Jordan Farmer. This is the Uncommon Ground YouTube channel where we are indoctrinating the masses, and today is a special day. It's Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and today I am going to be doing a video that I've been building up to for a long time, that I've been building up to since I've been doing this recent run of videos to specifically lay out. And coincidentally, I did not plan this until about 3-4 days ago. I did not plan on this video and me making this video falling on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So, needless to say, I'm nervous, but I'm just kidding. I'm not actually that nervous. But it's an important day and it's an important topic. It's one of, I'm going to tie together a whole lot of the other ideas that I've been talking about recently, and it all culminates into this. This is a supremely important point. So first off, I'm just going to address sort of the elephant in the room in this particular topic politically, and that is that some people believe that white people, me specifically, should not comment on matters of race or racism in America because we cannot have the experience of having dealt with racism as a black person, as a brown person, as an Asian person, or just as a non-white member of America. And that is fundamentally true. I can never have that experience. So you're not wrong necessarily, but you are, if you take that so far as to say that I cannot comment on these topics, or I shouldn't be voicing my opinion, or my opinion is somehow less valuable in this particular situation, I push back against that, mainly because you're denying my humanity in a certain sense, because I have the capacity as a human being to hear what the experiences of other human beings are, what their feelings were, what they've been through, to piece things together for myself and to be able to understand what it would be like hypothetically, in my ability to imagine what that scenario or what those experiences would be like, and how deeply that would hurt me or how deeply that would affect me. I have that capacity. Most human beings do. Most human beings, if they chose to really exercise that, could have that capacity. I would say all of us pretty much. So, and on top of that, on top of the fact that you're denying me my humanity, you're denying my ability to understand, most of the people that say this crap are white themselves talking about race. Just they're repeating what people of color have said, and that somehow in their mind gives them the authority to be some sort of a frickin' soldier on these issues. But if you're not a Democrat talking about race, if you're not a white Democrat talking about race, then white people can't talk about race. But if you talk about it in the way that Democrats talk about it, then you're just a soldier for the cause, and somehow you hack the system. As long as you're just relaying things. So my only point is that those people are a little ridiculous and silly. Everyone should be talking about race, because we can all listen and attempt to understand and attempt to tackle these issues. It just takes that, you have to be willing to understand that if someone doesn't have your experience, you have to bridge that gap through explanation. So you have to get good at explaining what's going on. Also, to the extent that you cannot blame individuals who are not responsible for systems and for what's going on in society and for history, the better. I was born in 1994. How are you going to hold me responsible for anything that happened before 1994? How could I even, through my unconscious racism, have somehow done anything, or like as a 5-year-old, done anything in this fight? Yes, you have a responsibility to wake up and to learn new things and to listen, but to think that you're somehow responsible for what's happened in history or for what racism exists in the world when you're not participating in it in yourself is a sick mindset, in my opinion, and a very dangerous one, and one that's been manipulated. And I'll get more into that as time goes on. So now I'd like to just break down the essential differences between racism and systemic racism for the purposes of this video. Racism fundamentally is in people's hearts. It's a people problem. And systemic racism is essentially, or in its nature, a policy problem, and it's in the system. So you got to separate those two out from the onset before we even have this discussion. If you're just talking about not getting hired at a job because of that racist individual, that's racism in people's hearts, and that is only able to be tackled or addressed through understanding that it is a belief system. It is a belief system and an ideology, and an inaccurate one, that makes comments in the world and say this is the way the world is. And for people that are super disagreeable in terms of personality traits, super close-minded, and maybe they have bad experiences, or they were raised like they were turned into or nurtured in this direction, across all races. So racism is not a white people only issue. It's an issue in every single race, and it's an issue from every single race to every single other race. You can hate people and oversimplify a whole category of people based off of race, and this happens in all directions. It's not just a white people issue, so we shouldn't treat it like that, and we should just recognize that racism is this cross-cultural human issue. Anywho, but it is a belief system commenting on the world and saying that there's something inherent about the races that is different. Something inherent about the races that makes certain races, and for white supremacists, it's white race. It's the white race. For black supremacists, it's the black race. You know, the pro-melanin, if you don't have melanin, you're not connected spiritually sort of crowd. And there's all sort of others. There's Asian racism, there's intra-Asian racism, there's, you know, there was the sort of funny racism of if you're not the right Anglo-Saxon English kind of white back in the day, then you're the wrong kind of white, you know. So racism is just a human issue, and it's a belief system about the world. And so you need to tackle it as a belief system. It's ideas in someone else's head. Wrong ideas, wrong belief systems, and a wrong ideology in someone else's head. What do I mean? What do I mean? This is how you have to approach it. Most people, when they come across someone who's overtly racist, or just overtly a Trump supporter for that matter, they tend to treat them like trash, or at least they tend to treat them like, whoa, that's a crazy person. And I came across in Sanger, California, to any of the locals there, you guys will know who I'm talking about. I came across a gentleman who came up while I was petitioning and working my political stuff, came up to me, and he had a MAGA hat on, a shirt that said 100% white, and something else. I can't remember. But every other word, he intentionally and for no reason made sure he brought up black and brown people, and he only used, you know, bad words for them, beaner and the N-word and stuff like that, and just left and right. And I was like, this dude's like a cartoon character to me. I'm like, holy crap, how is anyone really like this? And I was like, holy crap. But being me and believing that no one is beyond reach when it comes to reasonable political discussion and reasonable discussion as human beings, I decided to take on this dude as a little project in the moment, and I engaged with him. I did engage with him, and I asked him why he believes what he believes, and he brought up the Bible verse about different, like a lamb and a wolf or whatever, and I was like, well, we're saying that, you know, different species, basically what that says, like literally, is different species shouldn't marry, and we're not different species, so I shut down his arguments there. And then the other idea is like that there's somehow the more sort of Christian philosophical thing that could be perverted is, you know, you will not make yoke with someone who is not like you or whatever. And that's just a religious thing. If you're not the same religion, it's very difficult if you don't have the same deep to your soul values to actually make a relationship work. There are unique exceptions to that, but for the most part, it's quite difficult. And it depends on how open your religion is to other religions, obviously, in terms of how that can actually work. But anywho, so I kept talking to this guy, and eventually he just said, well, you see, I'm just too old to change my ways. And one of my favorite things to do when it comes to political discussion or understanding, because I'm not only trying to learn and trying to probe so that I can get information out of people, but I'm also trying to advocate for my beliefs, because I consider all these issues to be of importance. So I'm playing the game on both ends, trying to convince people, trying to elicit new information from them, and I'm always doing this. And when I back someone into a corner who I know has bad ideas, and they start giving all sorts of obvious weak retorts, they don't address any of the arguments, or they say something like, I'm just too old to change, I know that I've gotten through to them, and they've heard themselves verbally retreat. And that is a victory, because they will go home having understood that. So the way you fight racism, the ideology, is through reasoned argument and evidence and experience. And so the evidence and experience is what Daryl Davis does, and that is going and showing a racist white man that a black man can be cool and chill and fine. And eventually, he's either going to be so boneheaded and not reflect on it that he just doesn't change, in which case, whatever. But someone in that group, or hopefully him, will eventually realize that, hey, there's this black guy who seems pretty cool. Maybe not all black people are terrible, because here's an example that there's evidence that shows me. So all human beings have what's called a novelty response, and that's a response to what is not known, to new information. And depending on your personality and your training and programming and societal conditioning and all that fun stuff, you will react to the unknown in various ways. The unknown always carries with it the total potential of all bad things and all good things. And we don't know what the unknown is. So until you have integrated the unknown into the known in your own system, people have varying abilities / willingness, have different levels of willingness and ability to do this. You can integrate that new information. Most of the people who are used to and comfortable around, or not, that don't have any sort of friction between them and other races, typically will grow up with those races, because they connect and have experience in all the little subtle cultural and personal moments that bridges the gap between the two. I know that I'm connected more to Hispanic culture than I am any other culture that I'm not personally a part of, because of my experiences and where I grew up in Central California. And I love that. And my boss in Utah, California was a Mexican dude, and we hit it off great. And it was partially because of special unique interests, but it was also because we shared a similar sense of humor, and we shared a few other things that I believe had some sort of crossover in terms of our ability to get along and our particular personalities meshing. I mean, maybe not. I'm not saying that that's the only thing. There were obvious common interests, but these kinds of things tend to help in these scenarios, and they tend to bridge the gap. So, what is it called? Exposure therapy is exposure therapy, and reasoned arguments are the ways to shut down this ideology. Not telling them they're a terrible, horrible, messed up person for believing what they believe and seeing the world the way they do. People will never change their mind if you attack them for that. But if you try to say, look, I see what you see, but I see it differently, and then you explain why, and then you get down to the nitty-gritty of it. So that gets me to, almost lost you. That gets me to the next topic, which is frankly one of the most controversial topics in intellectual discussions, period, especially in American history and especially now. And that is specific differences between the races. Differences like economics, like how much money different groups make, are used and brought up all the time on the left, mainly, to illustrate systemic racism, to show systemic racism as a proxy sort of marker. So certain differences between the races are worth bringing up because they fit the narrative of the left. Other differences between races they ignore And so the racists kind of will be discussing amongst themselves and coming to very stupid conclusions in regards to that particular discussion. And so we stay where we're at. So I am going to take the step into the abyss. Not really, it's not that big of a deal, but it shouldn't be that big of a deal, but people treat it this way. And I'm going to address the differences between races, why there's differences between races, and how some of that gets messy when it comes to race and IQ. Because IQ predicts success and predicts all sorts of things in society. And people, for some reason, equate intelligence with value as a human being. And they don't understand race as a sort of phenomenon. And so they get all mixed up into a whole bunch of bad conclusions. So I'm going to define race. I'm going to define race first by my conception of it. And then based off of that, I will explain what all the other sort of things that I just sort of laid out. The races are just little pockets of human beings that exist on the entire human being spectrum that, for whatever reason, in specific areas, had specific environments and specific conditions for success and survival, and had different values as cultures and societies, so that in over time, different types of qualities emerge, and you have hyper specialized little pockets of human beings that are most similar to each other, but also similar to all of the other hyper specialized groups in their humanity and in their big sort of traits. But there's little averages and little subtle differences between all these because of these different factors that go into selection pressure. This is, mainly women. I'll say well, I hate getting hung up on this because I feel like I have to jump back and forth and play all these different sides. Men and women both assess their partners not just off of looks or just off of the money that they have, but off of the values that they have, the education that they have, to the extent that they value education or don't value education. There's all these other factors, and when you have certain types of individuals procreating more than other types of individuals in a population, that portion of the population will carry its genetic lineage forward more, and so the average of the entire population gets skewed into the direction of who's actually carrying on the population. So if you have certain values like getting an education, or you have different skills carried generation to generation, you'll have an intergenerational effect of sorts, and you'll have different traits emerge in different capacities, and or not different capacities, but in different quantities or amounts, or more or less common amongst the people. You'll have these different traits emerge based off of all those environmental factors given and over time. But any of the races all have the same personality traits, all exist on the same personality spectrums. We all have the same genetic components. We can all procreate together, so there's no concrete differences between us. It's just it's like the difference between the red wolf and the black, or the red fox and the black fox, That's basically the difference. Part of that difference is IQ, is intelligence. And it's not just about the values of the society, but it's also about the underlying factors in the environment, and education and financial socioeconomic status and education and your parental IQ and your environment all fuel the growth or the slowing down of, or the increasing or the decreasing or the whatever rate of change of various traits, including IQ. An example of this happening in real time was the Jewish community in the 20th century, in the 1900s. When they first started coming over, they had below average IQs, and then as time went on, they wound up having above average IQs. And that was because of certain pockets of the population, the more intelligent ones, being valued more by the society, them being, and so that skews the average and brings it up relative to others. So the differences that you see at one given point between the races are only at that one given point, and it's because of a whole array of factors, some of which have to do with this value-laden selection pressure between human beings and how the values that the society values get propagated just as much as the people do. So you have to understand that, and you have to understand that there are differences between races, and if you have one race that on average has a lower IQ than the other, and they're engaging or competing in intellectual endeavors, you're going to see different outcomes. And so you have to correct for that when you're looking for systemic racism or you're looking for oppression. But that doesn't mean that that is all the oppression, and that doesn't mean that the oppression can't create the effect in reverse and create not just within a generation but across generations. It can create the opposite effect where you are dragging the average of the population artificially in a weird direction because you're paying people to behave a certain way. So all that is to say that race is a a construct that comments on a real phenomenon, but a fluid and not concrete phenomenon that is totally malleable. That's why you have mixed race people, because you can just change it up and add all the different parts up however you want. Okay, now I'm getting on to systemic racism. Systemic racism fundamentally is racism in the system. Now, we used to have explicit bits of racism in the system, or overt oppression of the races, by having laws like slavery or Jim Crow, in which certain races were treated legally differently than other races, and you violated equality under the law. And you've also had, at the exact same time, covert, not just overt oppression, but covert oppression that subtly and through indirect means holds certain groups down. And when the 1963 Civil Rights Act went through and Jim Crow was gone, slavery was gone also, you had a dramatic shift after that, and that's the essence of this video. You had a dramatic shift after that to covert systemic racism, which I'll get into. Now, in order to understand how this all went about and why this happened, you need to have a little bit of a history lesson. The Democrat Party currently is an anti-racist party to the degree, to such a degree, that their conception of their political enemies, Republicans, are all racist, coincidentally. So if all of your political enemies are racist, it's very easy to be very anti-racist. But being anti-racist and non-racist are slightly different, because if you call someone racist and you're anti-racist, then it calls for action against that person. But if you're just non-racist, then you can still stand against them, but it doesn't demand that sort of offense or aggressive action to go fight it for you. Also, if you know that a particular population is disproportionately poor, and you create policies that make sure that that disproportionately poor part of the population will not only stay and remain poor, but other types of dysfunction and disruptions will be intentionally sent to that part of society on the economic spectrum, that can create a de facto or an emergent systemic racism. If you know the right underlying policies create the right effect and target the right particular part of the population, and you know that particular part of the population is a particular race, and you know that going in and you implement it, that can be very easily recognized as de facto or emergent systemic racism. Intentionally implemented, but it's indirectly implemented. And so that's the fundamental sort of crux of the systemic racism that I believe in, and that I believe currently exists, although we did have overt systemic racism before that everybody knows, but now it's much more subtle. So a quick history lesson on the overt racism of the past. You had slavery and Jim Crow, which everyone knows. But you also had the creation of the police, which in their initial incarnation were intended to defend property, which means that they were going after and bringing slaves back to the plantations, and whenever they felt like it, finding a black person and taking them back anyways, because they should have been a slave anyways. And they might as well belong to the people paying them. And they'll probably pay anyways, regardless of who's brought back. So, the police have been, and as recent as I believe 2020, or even I think it was the beginning of this year, 2021, I'm not sure on the dates right now, but there was a Supreme Court case that showed that the police are not there to actually defend human beings and safety in public scenarios and property, because obviously I think both are fine. People should come first and then property after. But actually their obligation is to defend property. So they're still, in a certain sense, corrupt based off of that original sin. So there's a deep, deep, deep history there. Plus, according to Daryl Davis and inside reports, certain police departments, like the Baltimore Police Department, have up to 15% KKK members, and some portion of those are just going to be racist sympathizers that aren't actually members of the KKK. And we have not gone through all of our police forces or our even public institutions and gone through and fired all of the white supremacists or the KKK members, which is an obvious issue that we need to address and need to clear through. Now, if police can't do anything to abuse citizens, then their ability to abuse citizens is muted. But but until that happens, by giving certain citizens the ability to abuse other citizens, and then they don't screen for this automatic and obvious issue, then you end up with the police literally being the enemy of this particular part of the population, which is the opposite of what the police and law enforcement should be. And so it's an obvious issue, and it's an issue that we need to address thoroughly and systemically. And I'm all for using the very powerful institutions like the FBI and the intelligence agencies to track all the white supremacists down, to make sure that we're locking them away for their stupid beliefs or anything like that, but we just want to make sure that their beliefs do not conflict with their job in any of these sort of ways. The last bit of not overt, but actually one of the first pieces of, as well as the police, one of the first bits of covert systemic racism was actually the introduction of the minimum wage. Now, please don't take away this video. Please hear me out. And it's important for all black Americans to understand their history. After the liberation of the slaves, or after the Americans were no longer enslaved, after the 1865 and onward, all the way to the implementing of the minimum wage in the early 1900s, the black community in the United States exploded economically, socioeconomically, and in terms of education and literacy and all those things. And they were gaining crazy economic ground on the rest of the population by saying, okay, I make no money now. You make $15 an hour for this construction job. I am just as good as you, and I'll do it for 10. And either the white guy says, I'll take 10 too to keep the job, or the racist white owner of the business says, I can make a lot more money off of this guy, so I'll hire him. I might hate his guts. I might think he's less than me and scum, but I'll hire him because I can hire him for cheaper than him. And so you have this competition on the low end of the labor spectrum that lifts over time, lifts the bottom of the labor spectrum into the rest, and it averages everything out. You have this sort of I can compete through cheaper labor way of averaging out and creating equality in the labor market and ultimately in the system. The minimum wage prevents that from happening. It cuts that out of the system. So it says you cannot now compete through lower wages, and thus it limits the amount of jobs that can exist, and it limits the types of job you can have unless you create enough productivity to be worth that amount per hour. And so it actually locked a lot of people out of jobs and actually enforced or reinforced and created a supportive comfort or cushion for discrimination in economics. And discrimination doesn't make sense economically because it's all about who's the best worker, who's the most productive, who's the best investor. It's all about the money. It's not about the race. So there's the inherent contradiction between capitalism and racism that makes capitalism actually eat away at and ultimately dissolve racism as an ideology. So that is another way in which there was these covert types of systemic racism that existed and that were implemented not just by the Democrats, but largely by the Democrats up until 1963. And then in 1963, you had the Civil Rights Act, and you had a social revolution where the majority in America clearly and resoundingly said, we are not pro-racism. Racism is bad. We need equality under the law for all races. We need all these rights so that you can't discriminate even in your business, even in your private business, you can't discriminate. We need to push into that front to make sure that we're fighting this racism issue. So any politician that wanted to stay in office had to toe that line. So this gets to the great switch and the biggest lie and the greatest PR job ever done in American history. The Democrats, up until the Civil Rights Act, were the party of racism, were the party of the Dixiecrats, and the party of holding black people down. The people that were in office in Congress and all the different levels in government didn't magically, they changed their rhetoric, but they didn't magically go out of office in the 1960s and 70s. It wasn't until the 80s that the federal position started to really change. So the old regime was still responsible for all of the policies that came for another 15, 20 years after the Civil Rights Act. Amongst these, and this is where you get into the switch from the overt racism that they could no longer sell to the American public to covert racism. And you saw this in Lyndon Baines Johnson when he said, how can you expect a man who's starting 40 feet behind to be able to catch up to a man who's 40 feet ahead of him? If they're both, in the same race and one guy's starting behind. Well, first off, it's not just one race. It's the same race day in and day out. Second, through working harder than the person who has it easier than you, you can gain that ground. And it's not like every person who's currently in a successful position is working their hardest. But that belief that there's somehow some inadequacy or some lack of capacity to compete in minority groups is racism itself. It's subtle racism. It's the racism of low expectations, I think is what Bush said. One of the few, good little terms that came out of that frickin' guy. And we wound up with a whole bunch of policies that were sort of partially masked by sympathy, partially masked by law and order, that starting in 1970 were implemented because the gap between the races was going to close. The economic growth, this is important to point out, the economic growth of 1945 to 1970 was astronomical, high growth rates. And during that time, from 1940 to 1960, the black community in the United States reduced the poverty rate in their community by from 87% to 47%. But in the decades following, that slowed down dramatically, especially after 1970. Why? Well, if you have the same racist people in office who just make that subtle and very smart political switch to overt versus covert racism, outright believing that they're less than, to subtle ways of believing they're less than, you can then get away with, and they did, and also the Democrats at that time were socialists as well, and so that didn't change after the fact. They just stayed socialist and went anti-racist instead of racist. But that led to a whole bunch of policies being implemented soon after that then began to hold the poorest communities in the United States down. And they knew at that time that minority communities were disproportionately poor. And so these dysfunctional policies and intentionally oppressive policies masked in a wig of love and compassion and understanding and all that stuff, that started to hold those people down and hold them back and keep the averaging out from happening by intentionally targeting the poorest communities, which they knew were disproportionately of minority status or minority race. And so the effect of that policy would keep those people held down. Now, what were those policies that were implemented that now create this de facto systemic racism that I've been talking about? First and foremost, you have economic depravity, or when the economy is intentionally made worse so that you have an extra number of dependent people in the country. So immigration, excess immigration, when you have X number of jobs and you have X number of workers and you add more workers but not more jobs, now you have workers, as I said earlier, competing for jobs by lowering wages, but that brings more people into the economic arena and makes them more productive, but it also pushes wages down relative to that productivity, which decreases labor inputs, increases and maximizes profits. Ding, 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 you have a winner. And it's not and I just want to be clear, I'm pro-immigration. We only increase our own labor pool by 100,000 jobs a month, but we create about 250,000 when the economy was normal. So we need a certain amount of people coming in to fill up those slots so that the so that the consumption pool grows, so that the wages grow, and so that we grow the tax base, so that everything, because like that's untapped potential that isn't getting activated by the lack of labor. And it takes a long time for wages to go up enough for people to start having enough babies for the increased population domestically to catch up. And because they've been diluting our wages for so long, that's why so many few people can afford to have kids now, or choose to have kids now, in part. And so we are so the excess immigration hurts the poorest communities because it ensures that those who have the least leverage economically make sure that they're in the worst position to negotiate at the same time. Whereas if you had labor scarcity, so you make sure that the number of jobs available always exceeds the number of laborers available, that creates a scenario where employers compete for workers and you have systemic raising of wages because of supply and demand. The other side of that, so you have excess immigration. Now you have trade deals that opened up. So from 1945 to 1970, if you watch our little growth chart, GDP growth chart, it was astronomical and high, and we took zero trade deficits until 1971. Then we started taking trade deficits, and you see the trade deficit line go from flat because we're taking nothing to down, and then you see our GDP growth, which is like here and going up here. And then once you do that, then it's down here. So it was like 8, 12, 16% growth before, 2, 3, 4% growth now. And that's on purpose, and that's because of the trade deals. So you reduce the demand for labor, especially cheap manufacturing, bottom of the barrel labor. You keep the poorest people down. You make sure there's always an excess supply of labor. You always make sure that they're poor and that they can't catch up, and that wages never grow. So it feeds the international corporate interests, but it also feeds the domestic racist interests. So excess labor, decreased demand for labor, going off the gold standard, which inflates out our wages and our values, created hyper stagflation in the 1970s. That hurts people too. Then you have the war on drugs that gets launched, that goes in and makes sure that there's more cops protecting property on the streets to go and to try to find people and prosecute them and fill up our prisons to make sure that that industry and those special interests are taken care of. That disrupts the family and the home, and that creates excess poverty in and of itself within the black community. And then on top of that, and if you're already in a poor community or poor neighborhood, that's where the crime is going to happen. So if that's where the cops get sent because that's where the crime is happening, then that's where the majority of the disproportionate prosecutions are going to take place. Plus, because minority communities have hyper criminalization because they live in these poorer communities, that masks a certain amount of the data, and that's why, even though more basically the gap between the number of minority people killed by police in proportion to the population relative to the number of white people, like the disparate effect in murders, is masked by the disparate surrounding and being involved in crime. It can be masked that way. That's a subtle way in which they trick the whole system, so that they say, well, we don't kill them more than we kill the rest. Yeah, but tons of evidence, tons of studies show that you actually abuse them and physically harm them way more than you do the others. And if we have bad laws, we have bad law enforcement, because if we are going in and arresting people for smoking weed, you're the bigger criminal than they are. And so if you're doing that mostly to black people, you are victimizing them disproportionately, even if it's technically a crime. And you have the ramping up and the rolling out and the continuation of welfare programs in the Great Society programs that LBJ passed that create a system that intentionally tries to pay women, which it makes it so that women get paid more from the government if the guy is out of the house than in the house. And it makes it so that you get more money if you're in an economically worse off position. So if you stay in that bad position and you stay dependent on the government, your lifestyle stays pretty steady and consistent. And as you try to better yourself, or you try to develop those within a generation and across the generation skill sets to develop, to increase the IQ of the population and all those good, positive, functional things, you, instead of developing all those, you develop the opposite, and you develop your skill sets for survival adapt around dependence on the system. And if you know from the time you're a baby that if you're a man and you get a girl pregnant, she can just go on welfare and be fine, and you know as a woman that you can just go on welfare and be fine if you get pregnant, you're not gonna be as likely to be as responsible with those decisions. Whereas if you know you're going to get a certain amount of help from the government, but if you choose to take on kids and get pregnant, it's still going to make your life harder, and you're going to have to make sacrifices. Or if you can't take care of that kid, they get taken from you, then you're going to have an entirely different approach to dealing with that issue. So, and then on top of that, you have an education system where your parents can afford to pay rent is where you get to go to school. And because schools are funded through property taxes, schools in poor communities get less money per kid, and schools in richer communities get more money per kid. Which means, and you can't get your kid out of that particular school district. They don't even have a lot of competition within the school district. And the government has its hands in your education. So not only are you getting poor funding and intentionally being screwed disparately by being in that poor community based off of our education system, but the whole system itself also, keep this in mind, is dictated by our government, which means that it's going to have a say in what gets published and what doesn't, and what gets taught and what doesn't. Which is why, on one hand, too many people have such a overly rosy and positive sense of America's history, and on the other hand, tons of people think that we're somehow uniquely evil, when the reality is, and this gets back to some bigger points here, the United States in some aspects is just as evil as many other countries and entities and empires throughout history. But at the same time, the United States has done things so much better and more special and meaningful and mighty in the humanitarian cause than other countries that you have to give it that respect. So we are great, but we are also deeply flawed. And we must accept that about ourselves. Otherwise, we cannot ever accept that about our politicians, and we will never have real politicians. We'll always have these fake bastards who tell us what we want to hear and never actually get anything done. That's a little side point. I'm sure you can pick up on what I'm saying there. My point is, our education system feeds into this as well. And so when you have certain communities that are disproportionately poor, that are caught in a vortex of dysfunction intentionally built into the system, those people are going to be held down by that system through no fault of their own, because as much as you have a capacity as an individual, the systemic forces can overcome your capacity as an individual, and they influence the average of your outcome no matter what. If you start here, you can grow and move forward only so much. So if you start behind, you'll end up behind still. And that's the whole 40 feet behind idea. But the next generation then has a better starting position. And as time goes on over generations, things average out if you have the right policies in place. So I've laid out all these various policies. The war on drugs and policing I'll lay on the hands of the right. They're very ignorant in terms of the issues related to that. But when it comes to our education system, when it comes to welfare, when it comes to increased cost of living, which makes people more dependent than they have to be, and that's intentionally done. And when you have low economic opportunity, you have the trade deals, and all these various things, the left is to blame as well. The left is not innocent in this regard. But here's what you need to understand. Most people are not a part of this system, and a lot of people on both sides are not a part of the system, but the establishment is okay with and reinforcing and maintaining this system. So we don't have overt systemic racism in our country anymore. We have all of these kinds of covert systemic racism, or emergent de facto systemic racism, that holds different people who are disproportionately poor back artificially. That is legit systemic racism. It is de facto systemic racism, and it was planned and intentionally implemented to hold those groups back. So only by reversing those policies can we then fix that underlying economic oppression that has all sorts of side bits of dysfunction. If minority communities were richer, they'd have more lawyers who can compete and fight on the legal front more for all these different causes. If minorities were richer, they'd have more doctors so that their health and their health outcomes could be better taken care of, assuming they're all still living, as tightly together as they do. You have to look, and I encourage everyone to do this, you have to look at the big, poor, oppressed black populations in the United States, start from the local level and work your way up to the federal level, and look at who is in those positions of power at the mayor level, who has great influence over the police department, at the county level, who affects the education system usually and other things, at the state level, and they affect all sorts of stuff there, and then at the federal level ultimately. When you look at it that way, and you look at which minority populations are the most oppressed and the most economically oppressed and who are being arrested the most and are in the worst positions, they're largely led by Democrats. Why? Because of the greatest PR job in American history, because of the greatest lie ever told, and that is that the Democrats are on the side of minorities in some deep, meaningful way. They say it, the politicians say it, some of them mean it, and many, many Democrats that are average Joe Democrats absolutely mean it, but it has not delivered for these groups, because the policies that the left supports that reinforce this system have been ignored, because the left can't see its own flaws, and because the right can't see its own flaws. We are now in this position where we have de facto systemic racism that goes ignored, unacknowledged, and misunderstood. Here's a funny little point. Many of the things I talk about, the dysfunctions of welfare, the dysfunctions of the education system, the dysfunctions of economic policy, all are points brought up and talked about on the right. And people on the right believe in equality under the law, so they don't believe in the abuse of citizens by police, but they just don't know that it's happening. They don't know to what degree it's happening, and they don't know how to fix it. And it's a little complicated in terms of qualified immunity and stuff. But the right understands the problems with these policies, but the word systemic racism, or the phrase, was hijacked by the left, so they see the word and the general idea that is correct as the enemy, but all these underlying policies they actually understand. So that right there, this gap between the left and the right on systemic racism and acknowledging all sides and really seeing it for what it is, that shows you the toxicity in politics that keeps us from seeing the truth that is before our eyes. Many times in politics, you'll have one side that has this sort of generalized, correct view about the world and a good commentary on the world, but the other side nitpicks, and even though they have things that actually reinforce that worldview, they don't see it because they're intentionally not looking for that. They're looking for the opposite. They're looking for disagreement and ways to combat. Because accurately, if you combat in a discussion about various topics, you'll learn more, they'll learn more, and you'll be better and closer to the truth on the other side. So, systemic racism is real. It needs to be fought. It needs to be fought by moderates. We need to get into the game. And more than anything, Americans need to come together as Americans and recognize that the problems that we have with our education system is how it's failing human beings that are Americans. The problem with our police system, with our jail system, prison system, incarceration system, justice system, all of these problems in America are problems for Americans that need to be properly addressed and handled, discussed, and understood, and then need to be fought as Americans for all of us. We don't have to have a inherently competitive or combative political system. We can have a cooperative political system that leverages good faith competition for the best results, but is ultimately about cooperating, because it's not about which team wins, it's about playing the game of football. It's not about which side wins, it's about playing the game of politics properly. And how we do that is by acknowledging problems, trying to solve problems, trying to not judge other people for not understanding exactly what we understand, and trying to just be genuinely good citizens. And that's why I am just a citizen trying to understand this shit. I hope I illuminated some things for you. I hope I told you some things you didn't know. I hope that we can now eventually get to a place where we can all focus on systemic racism and fix it. Good day to you. Like, subscribe, share, hit the notification bell, and let's level up our political understanding. I'll see you back tomorrow. Happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day.